Greetings. How can academics best conduct scientific research and teaching in a time of extraordinary pressures? That's the subject of this week's Future Transformed session, where we are fortunate to host the astonishing Dr. Peter Hotez as our guest. He's a world-renowned biologist and disease specialist. In this hour of conversation, we touched on how funders might oppose or support science, the destructive role of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., ways of encouraging scientific literacy, sources of optimism, and a lot more. This session is a follow-up to the previous weeks, where we hosted Dr. Hotez's co-author, University of Pennsylvania professor, and legendary climate scientist Michael Mann. We'll have links to that show, to their most recent book, and to their biographies in show notes. We'll also have a link to the Future Transforms website, where you can learn more about our program. I hope you enjoy this session. We're eager to hear your thoughts in the comments box below. Begin. Let me welcome everybody to the Future Transform. I'm really glad to see all of you here today. We have a fantastic guest talking about one of the most vital topics of our time, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But before we begin the conversation, let me just introduce the program, explain what it is, what we hope to accomplish, who we are, and then we'll start off with our discussion. Because discussion is really the theme. If you're new to the Future Transform, our idea here is that through discussion, through questions and answers, through pushback, through agreement, we can best grapple with the future of higher education. And we've been doing this. Coming up now, our 10th anniversary is next month, just in a few weeks. And when I say we, there are a few of us. I'm Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's host. I'm the creator. I'm your guide to the next hour. We often have a lot of other people with us today. Wes and Radomski can't make it, but we miss them very much because they do great work. Now, when I say discussion, how it actually works in practice often is through the chat box. People in the forum love to use the chat to share questions, to share answers, footnotes, job offers, puns, good puns. And in fact, if you haven't done so already, just take a minute in the chat and just say who you are and where you are geographically. I'll do it myself. I'm Brian in Northeastern Virginia. And we say hello to Greg Britton, the awesome editor from Baltimore, and our friend Tom Hames coming to us from Houston. And we have, let's see, Wisconsin, more Northern Virginia. We have University of Rochester. I hope, RJ, I hope you're staying warm there. And Dylan, good to see you. And Florida is represented, and California, and Utah, and so on. Monterey Bay. Hello, Amanda. It's good to see everybody. RJ, I bet it's cold out there. Take care. And speaking of cold, hello, Bran. Please stay warm in Manitoba. I know how cold we can get there. Well, all of the next hour, please monitor the chat. I'll contribute to it. Share your thoughts. I'll be bringing those up, and I'll be reading those out loud for our conversation. Now, the Q&A box is also open, so if you would like to leave a formal question, please type into that, and I'll pop that up when the time is right for everyone to see. And I'll read it out loud. And later on, we might just be able to uncork our microphone so people can talk out loud. There's no presentation here, no slides, just all of us questioning together. Now, we can only do this work with the help of some generous supporters. I want to thank them before we go much further. One of them is NYSERNet in New York State. That's a nonprofit that helps at states, colleges, and universities do great work together on high-speed broadband, but also with professional development work. And we're really grateful to them for their work as well as for their support. We're also grateful to our friends and supporters on Patreon. I'll put in a link there. Patreon's a crowdfunding site where people collaboratively fund some ongoing project. In our case, it's the project of collaboratively grappling with the future of higher education. People there contribute as little as $1 a month to make sure our machines are running, our lights are on. Some people there contribute as much as $10 a month. We're really grateful to them for their support. And you can join them. Just go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander. And hello to everybody else who's just come in. Margaret, hello to Detroit. And hello, Madeline in Centralia. Good to see all of you. And Michelle, please enjoy Southern California. For the rest of us, we'll pretend like, we're in nice, sunny, warm climes like yourselves. And there's a link to one of Peter Hotez's books. So that's a good transition. We've been covering the politics around knowledge off and on for about 8 years here in the Future Transform. We've hosted a variety of scholars who try to help us think about what it means to do academic scholarship and teaching in the face of various challenges and threats. Now, last week, we had the honor of hosting Dr. Michael Mann, one of the world's legendary climate scientists and a co-author of a new book on the opposition to science called Science Under Siege. And there we really focused on doing climate work, climate teaching, climate scholarship, climate action on campus, altering academic operations to try to improve them in terms of mitigating or adapting to climate change. And now we want to have this as a second part of a double header, if you will. We have with us the enormously talented, immensely titled, absolutely fantastic Dr. Peter Hotez, who is coming to Professor Hotez. Let me ask, are you in Baylor right now?
I'm at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. I'm in my office on the campus of the Texas Medical Center, the world's largest medical center, the first medical city of 120,000 employees, 60 institutions. We do everything big in Texas here in Houston.
Naturally, you do. Naturally,
Mm.
you do. Well, I'm so honored that you could join us, and I'm so glad that you could take time with us. Um, we have a tradition here on the forum of asking guests to describe themselves by talking about what they're going to be doing for the next year. So this is the Future Trends Forum. So the usual tradition of academic obituaries. What have you done? We've already pushed that out through email, but we're really curious looking ahead. What does 2026 look for you? What are the big projects and what are the big ideas top of mind for you?
Well, for me, it's, trying to stay optimistic amidst a lot of darkness, in this world of
Yes.
anti-science activism. But, I think, we've got a lot to look forward to. So just a word about me. I'm a vaccine scientist, pediatrician vaccine scientist. We developed the low-cost COVID vaccine that reached 100 million people in India and Indonesia with no patent strings attached, two to $3 a dose, providing proof of concept that you don't have to be a big pharma company to do big things in the vaccine space. So that's the first thing I'm doing is we want to reproduce that. We want, we hit a home run or two home runs with two vaccines, one for India and one for Indonesia. The now we want to reproduce that with one of the original vaccines I worked on for my MD PhD thesis 100 years ago or 40 years ago in New York City at Rockefeller University and Cornell on the Upper East Side of New York was for hookworm anemia.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
protecting, well, the paper is in press now. The protection is close to 100% protection of our hookworm anemia vaccine in human
Whoa.
trials. So we've de-risked it. But the problem now is what's the business model for it? For
Hmm.
COVID, the deal was you make it, you show it works. We had the Indian government, the Indonesian government guarantee the advanced purchase of hundreds of millions of doses. So it de-risked it for the local vaccine producer in India and Indonesia. For hookworm anemia, even though it's an important global health problem, it doesn't have that same urgency as COVID. So that's one of the real struggles is,
Mm.
the science, as complicated as it is not the hardest part. Our technical ability to make vaccines has outpaced our social, political, financial instruments that we have to get it out there. So that's a big struggle. And in fact,
Wow.
I just was on another Zoom, yet another Zoom, with and there's a lot of different actors, the donors, the World Health Organization, the local governments, the high net worth individuals. How do you incentivize them to do that? So that's big project number one. Big project number
Yeah.
two is the other hat I wear, and I'm glad Greg's on because I've written several books with Johns Hopkins University Press on this, in addition to the one with Michael on combating anti-vaccine activism, and I got involved in that in an interesting way. That book that Greg put in the chat, "Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism," that came out of a year of discussions I had with Bobby Kennedy, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., at the request of the National Institutes of Health to explain to him why vaccines don't cause autism, why it's implausible because of the genes involved in autism, and all those
Yeah.
notes that I compiled to because he would say all this crazy stuff and you'd have to look it
Hmm.
up and explain to him why the science that says the opposite. And so I had this amazing pile of notes and contacted Greg, and his associate Robin Coleman said, I think there's a book here, and we did. It was the book was called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. And unfortunately that made me public enemy number one or two with anti-vaccine groups. So um and getting heavily targeted in the death threats and everything else. But it also gave me a front row seat to understand what this is all about and how all of this corruption with the wellness and influencer industry and
Hmm. Hmm.
extremist politics all factored in on this and why the Maha movement is really not much more than an economic stimulus package for the wellness and influencer uh,
Oof. Oh.
in industry and explaining that whole ecosystem. So that's project number two. I thought I was going to retire my TV career because I was going, on the cable news channels a lot about COVID. And with the wind down of COVID, I said, wow, now I can get back to my stuff. And
Mm.
Mr. Kennedy seems determined to call me out of retirement, I think. So that's been a big activity. And then the third is I've started a new book project that I'm super excited about because I just needed a break from writing about the anti-science and all the darkness. And this one I'm absolutely loving. I've just signed on with MIT Press and retelling the history of Texas, where I'm based, through the lens of its epidemics um,
Mm.
and how
Mm.
epidemic illness, endemic malaria in the Austin colony, and how cholera swept into both Mexico and delayed Santa Anna's march into Texas, and also derailed the Austin colony, delayed the Texas Revolution by 3 years, or how
Mm.
Admiral Farragut and his navy
Mm.
wanted to enact what was called the Anaconda Plan
Hmm.
to block Confederate ports so they couldn't send out cotton in exchange for arms from Europe, and
Mm.
how they were successful in doing that, except when they got to Galveston and Indianola in the Texas coast, because there was so much damn yellow fever and malaria. None of Admiral Farragut's navy or the Union troops wanted to be garrisoned there because it was a death sentence. And
Oh.
how it changed the course of the Civil War, or an attempt on Lincoln's life to send out a bioweapon, not understanding that yellow fever is transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. They thought they would send bed linen from yellow fever patients
Mm.
to the White
Mm.
House, and then thinking that they were going to
Whoa.
assassinate Lincoln in his White House that way. So putting all those stories together, or another very interesting story about how the narrative that people always hear about when Cortez conquered the Aztecs
Hmm.
was, he brought in smallpox and measles, and that's what wiped out Native American populations in central Mexico and then moved up into towards Texas. That's partly true, but
Yeah.
also it turns out was an indigenous illness that the in the Nahuatl language was called Cocolitzli or
Mm.
Matlitzwatl, and it was as devastating or more in some cases. And now, through the science of metagenomics, where you can exhume remains from someone of that time and extract the DNA from a molar, and not only get the DNA sequence of the person, but any pathogens that are there as well. And it turns out it was paratyphoid type C.
Whoa.
And now papers come out in parallel that that was also the pathogen that affected Napoleon in his retreat from
Moscow?
Moscow. Yeah, and everyone says well, he's decimated by louse-borne typhus, and it turns out probably not. It was paratyphoid together with
Huh.
another louse-borne illness called relapsing fever, which is caused by a Borrelia. So
Fascinating.
putting all that together and to say, by the way, this is not just consigned to history, because now, because of new forces of climate change and urbanization, all these illnesses are coming back now, and we've embarked on a in our School of Tropical Medicine, very detailed program of climate health detection. Um,
Mm.
and we're
Mm.
finding all of these illnesses are not coming back. So we're doing the full genome of mosquitoes and ticks and reduvid trienamine bugs and fleas, and coming up with all these new pathogens that are emerging on the Gulf Coast in Texas, and to sound a climate and overlaying it with the climate science going on at Rice University, which is across the
Yeah.
street from us, to really understand how these now pathogens are all coming flooding back. So that's a new big program for the future, is well. When we talk about climate change, we don't talk enough about all of the pathogens
Mhm.
that are
Mhm.
emerging because of it. And Texas and the Gulf Coast is sort of ground zero for that.
First of all, that book sounds fantastic, and I think you've got a lot of people who in the chat who are very excited by it. And
Oh,
I'm
thanks.
already rethinking the Columbian Exchange, and I'm really thinking 1812 as a result. But also people are just praising you in the chat.
Oh, thanks. It's a
Are
new type of book for me because I'm not a historian. In fact, I got Greg will be interested in this one. A very prominent press, not you, Greg, but another prominent press actually, said thanks, but no thanks. They wrote a very polite note, nice note, but this guy Hotez is not a historian. And I said, well, I'm not trying to write another history of Texas,
Mhm,
right? I mean,
mhm,
there's a gazillion of them and some really excellent ones that I cite in the book a lot. But this is a little different. This is kind of telling the microbial historiography of
mm, mm.
Texas, which is quite different,
Strange.
and I love it.
We have Cecilia Vernes in the chat says that she always covers tick-borne illness when she demonstrates the use of the CABI Global Health Database, which is in our public health digital library program. One Health! Exclamation point. Uh,
Wonderful,
and
wonderful.
uh,
Yeah,
and we
tick-borne illnesses are really accelerating now on the Gulf Coast and actually nationally too. That's why
yeah.
there's a big increase in Lyme disease as well. But it's not just Lyme. There's all these other tick-borne illnesses that are really popping up in Texas in a big way.
Well, your work is unfortunately ever more needed, it sounds like.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thank
we
you.
we have well we in the book that you co-authored with Mike Mann, and building on what you just said, um, thinking about the anti-science forces that are arrayed against us, and you describe the press, you describe professionals, but you also describe plutocrats. And I had one, maybe this is a wonky question. Let me know if it is, but I'm wondering about the role of plutocrats in this challenge. You mentioned earlier, working with high net worth value individuals in order to try to fund the work that you're doing for tropical diseases. And higher education in general often depends on high net worth value individuals who give to us through foundations or through, elaborate awards. Think of people like Michael Bloomberg or Mackenzie Scott. But yet, at the same time, these plutocrats, some of them are also funding and supporting in different ways the anti-science measures you're discussing.
Well, they've had sort of historically they've had this Janus face, right? I mean,
Mm,
let's think of
mm,
some of our most prestigious universities, places that I've visited and spoken at Vanderbilt University or
mhm,
Carnegie Mellon University
mhm,
or
mhm,
where I did my MD PhD, Rockefeller Institute, Rockefeller
mhm,
University, during the late 1800s on the Gilded Age. They were called robber barons, right?
mhm, mhm.
And they did a lot of probably shady stuff, and yet they were incredible philanthropists at the same time. So there's always been that kind of duality. But now I'm concerned, with people. We wrote about someone like Elon Musk, who up until a while ago, I admired him. He came to Texas and created Space City and SpaceX, really, very innovative and cool. As a kid who probably became a scientist because I was one of these nerdy kids in 1965 who used to wake up at 5 in the morning and watch the Gemini rockets
Yeah.
go off. I mean, I've always had this profound admiration for space travel and astronauts and things. So I always thought it was great. And it was so disappointing, when he transformed Twitter into X and then turned it into this cesspool of attacks on science and not just on science, but on scientists
Yeah.
and this flood of vitriol and hate, all made up, all manufactured, for someone else's political control or for a very corrupt wellness industry that's selling alternatives. I mean, have you ever wondered why there are always anti-parasitic drugs, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, fenbendazole. It's because there's a bucket of it. You could buy it for cheap in bulk, and then you can repackage it. You jack up the price, and you sell it with a $1,600 telehealth visit. It's as simple as that. And then you got
Deal.
people like Joe Rogan pushing this nonsense and denigrating vaccines, which were saving lives. So, one of the things we talked about in both in my book with Johns Hopkins Press, Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, and the new book with Michael, is 200,000 Americans at least died because they bought that stuff, and they both literally and figuratively and went down this rabbit hole of anti-science, believing that ivermectin was just as good, and paid
Yeah.
for it with their lives. And so 200,000 Americans died because they refused COVID vaccines. And it was so frustrating for me, trying to plead with people, don't, I don't care about your politics. That's your right as an American citizen. You want to believe anything you want on politics, that's fine, but don't adopt this stuff because it's so deadly and so dangerous. And this is unfortunately now accelerating yet again with this administration and appointing Mr. Kennedy as Health and Human Services Secretary. I mean, he came out, right out from the beginning, right? We were in the middle of a terrible measles epidemic here in West Texas, and
Right.
2 kids died and 100 hospitalized. And he just started making up stuff, right? He said, no, the hospitalizations are due to quarantine or isolation. It wasn't true. They were sick with measles pneumonia. Or he said, the MMR is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is a leaky vaccine, whatever that means. It's not. And he says it declines in immune protection 4% per year. It actually does decline in protection, but it's 0.04% per year. So it's off by a
Wow.
factor of 100. And then, he says the vaccine's contaminated with aborted fetal remnants, which is absolute nonsense. This was, old school Mr. Kennedy coming back again. But then the new version of Kennedy is kind of interesting because the one thing that he's been saying now that's different from the way we spoke when I talked to him 10 years ago was, at the request of the NIH, was he says, well, yes, I guess you can get the MMR vaccine, or you can get an infusion of vitamin A budesonide and clarithromycin. And you're scratching your head and you say, where the heck does that come from? And then you realize this is all out of the wellness influencer industry. It's more
Mm,
snake oil that they're pushing.
mm,
And
mm,
so this is what MAHA is.
mhm.
It's my view, it's an economic stimulus plan for the very corrupt wellness and influencer industry. And for them to push the stuff, what they've got to do is denigrate mainstream science. And that's
Yeah.
why they go after me so aggressively, because I'm bad for business. And it's not just now pushing the snake oil, it's trying to tear at the whole fabric of biomedical science in America. So they're creating fake journals, they're basically WordPress documents
Yeah.
with editorial boards of people of unknown backgrounds and targeting, the mainstream journals like New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA,
Mhm.
going after the medical schools, and I just wrote this kind of interesting article. It's not fully formed. It's called a working paper. It's on the website of the James Baker Institute of Public Policy at Rice University. So if you
Mhm.
just Google Hotez and Baker Institute, it'll pop up as one of the papers. And it basically says, and this gets to our discussion of higher education. If you remember, Brian, back in 1910, the Carnegie Corporation for Education, or Carnegie Foundation for Education, I can't remember the exact name, commissioned a man named Abraham Flexner to go all over the country, both the US and Canada, visit every medical school in Canada and the US and write a report. And what that did was he shut down all the quack medical schools. He shut down they were called homeopathic medical schools, what were
Mhm.
called eclectic medical schools, which were these systems of botanicals, and got them out of there. And they were, and and really promote what was called scientific medicine as
Mhm.
exemplified. And sort of the gold standard, of course, was Johns Hopkins Medical School, which was the, kind of built on that whole system of German science and research. And he said, this is where we need to go, and laid the foundation for scientific medicine. Well, what Kennedy is doing now is reversing that, and he's basically trying to get back to the old eclectic homeopathic medical schools. And back then they were called sectarian. So you had the scientific medicine schools and the sectarian schools. He wants to bring back those
Hmm.
sectarian schools in this new form of wellness and influencer grifting in this whole world of pseudoscience. And the whole attack on higher education is beginning. Everyone's focused on, what they're doing at Harvard and places like that. But in my view, the more pernicious stuff that's going on is with the academic health centers and medical schools going after that to basically put in this whole alternative universe of pseudoscience.
Is there a role then for the AMA or any medical accrediting agency to try to draw attention to these guys?
They are, I mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics has been really good about at least debunking the vaccine stuff. And my good colleagues, Mike Osterholm at University of Minnesota and Bruce Gellin, have put together this vaccine integrity project, and some of the states are forming coalitions to counter some of this stuff. But it's kind of cherry picking things. It's no one has, one of the things that I'm trying to say is the vaccines, in my view, are just the foot in the door for a
Hmm.
much larger Maha assault on biomedicine and biomedical science in America, which is so tragic, right? I mean, one of our great,
Achievements.
American achievements, right? And watching it, dismantle, and he's doing this piece by piece by piece. He's very clever the way he's doing it in a nefarious way, but so every week, as I say, I keep hoping to retire my TV career, but every week he comes out with a new zinger, and I feel compelled to speak out and debunk it, even though it's at great personal risk and all the other stuff I have to endure.
Well, we're glad you do, and that's for the best of all of us. Friends, I have one more question I wanted to put to Dr. Hotez, but then I'd really like to hear from you all. And we already have a couple of questions coming up. And this is I guess this may be redundant, so let me know if it is. And one of the other P's that you describe are petrostates. And I remember vividly in November of 2024 when Trump was reelected or elected for the second time. Your colleague Mike Mann said the US is becoming a petrostate now, whereas China is becoming an electrostate. And reading your chapter on this and the other discussions in the book, one could think, oh, okay, well, some of the dangers are petrostates like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, but now it's also the US. How, what do you advise academics, both in public and in private institutions, to do when our own government has become a petrostate and how that exerts horrendous pressure
Yeah, and
across the
and
board?
by the way, with petrostate, there's two parts to that. There's like, friend, let me give you an example of a
Please.
petrostate that doesn't universally go after science, but except for where it affects their bottom line on oil, and that was
Mm,
Saudi Arabia, right? And
mm,
one of the few disagreements Michael and I had in the book was around Saudi, because I served as U.S. science envoy for two
hmm
years in the Obama administration, going all over the Middle East. And the Saudis were all in on biomedical science and
mm,
trying to
mm,
build up biotech. But they clearly, were doing terrible things about climate science and attacking climate scientists.
right.
But at least it made sense, right? It was purely transactional, right? Oil, they need oil for their economy. They're too dependent on oil, and so therefore they go after climate science. The weird thing about the American petrostate is, okay, I understand the oil and gas and companies, but why would you go after something like a vaccine? What's the
hmm
link there? And I don't know that we have all the I's dotted and T's crossed, but among them was, this very interesting Great Barrington document.
hmm hmm
That basically was very corrupt in my view, and it was called Great Barrington because it was signed or penned at an institute called the American Institute for Economic Research, based in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which receives funding not only from the Koch brothers but others. and reading about the role of from people like Walker Bragman and others on the role of the Koch brothers funding this stuff, and you would say, well, why would they fund that? And the answer was they were worried about um, economic slowdowns, and people wouldn't be using oil and gas to get to work, and therefore it would hurt
Oh,
the price of fossil fuels, which it did for a while. But then, of
yeah,
course, once vaccines became available, it bounced back. So they created this whole pseudo universe of this whole Great Barrington Declaration, which basically says it's fine for young people to run around and go to concerts and
right.
workplace and movies, and then we'll put grandma and grandpa in the closet and we'll I don't know, shove Swanson's turkey TV dinners under the door, and it was ridiculous, and it had no basis in science, and it was all run by people who were not an infectious disease. It was all, it was economists and all these other, people. And but it was very damaging. And then it was promoted heavily on Fox News,
Right.
and we documented the role of the Murdoch media empire in this.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
from several sources, Media Matters for America, a research group out of the Federal University of Science and Technology in Switzerland,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then the other piece was pushing back against the vaccine mandates, which I sort of understood. I didn't agree with it, but at least I understood it. So when at the CPAC conference of conservatives, you had
Hmm.
Matthew Coauthored, the representative from North Carolina, would say, first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And okay, you roll your eyes and say, yeah, whatever. But I didn't see that as the really harmful part. The harmful part was they didn't stop there. They then crossed into something very dangerous, which is they brought on, both Fox News did this, the CPAC conference did this, Joe Rogan did this. They brought on all the toxic, terrible anti-vaccine activists who falsely discredited the effectiveness and safety of vaccine to cause people to not even want to use vaccines. That's where it became deadly, and that's where it became unethical, in my opinion, and that's what I spoke out against and wrote about in the book.
I'm so glad you did. We actually have a friend of the program was living just a few minutes from Great Barrington when that declaration happened, and he was just sending us appalled notes. And that has really, really blossomed in a horrible way. I Let me stop asking questions because the audience has better questions, and I want to make sure they get a chance to answer them, Dr. Hotez. And there's one from our friends, Stephen Slota, who says, I'd love to hear how your understanding of mis and disinformation has evolved over the course of your career. Do you see opportunities or places where we might build up herd immunity versus critical discernment, critical thinking, and empathy skills?
Well, there's a few things. Well, one is the technology for disseminating the misinformation and disinformation is better, right? You've got social media, especially X and Twitter and other social media platforms. But I think there's, in my view, there's three game-changing things that have happened in the last decade
Mhm.
that have made it so treacherous and could undermine not only biomedicine, but the whole future of the United States. I think one was the fact that all the anti-science disinformation was adopted by a major political party in the United States, right? That never made sense to me, right? All of a sudden, you had the House Freedom Caucus and
Mhm.
people like Senator Rand Paul and Ron Johnson, holding these phony baloney vaccine injury roundtables, and the fact that it was adopted by a major political party. I mean, think of the Republican Party as, the party of Eisenhower. I mean, Abraham Lincoln started the National Academy of Sciences.
Mhm.
Eisenhower started NASA, right? I mean,
Mhm.
George
Mhm.
H.W. Bush, and when I came to Texas 15 years ago, meeting people like George H.W. Bush or Jim Baker, they were all in on science. So
Mhm.
what happened that the Republican Party started adopting this stuff, and how it became linked to libertarian philosophy of health freedom
Mm.
and medical freedom. So that was the first bad thing that happened. The second was the wellness influencer industry, profiting
Yeah.
off of anti-science, and And these are wealthy people. By one number that I found was the wellness and influencer movement industry is a $0.4 trillion industry.
Oh,
It's real money, right?
wow.
And pushing all the snake oil. So that's the second piece. And then the third piece is still, in motion, and that is the role of AI in disseminating
Mm, mm,
disinformation. So my friend and colleague Renee DiResta, who was kicked out of the Stanford Internet Observatory, basically,
mhm,
the members the House Freedom Caucus shut it down. They told Stanford to shut it down, and they caved immediately. And she was out of a job. She had written this really impressive article early on in the pandemic, although it wasn't necessarily related to the pandemic, but it came out in the Atlantic around that time, and it was called something to the effect of how disinformation is about to go infinite, meaning the role of using AI to spread disinformation. I got asked to review for one of the JAMA journals. I got asked to review an article, which I ultimately wrote a commentary on. This group at Australia um, uh, used three different AI programs to generate health disinformation blogs. One of the on two topics: vaccines and vaping. I don't know anything about vaping, but they had me to review because of the vaccines. And what they found was the Google and the Microsoft AI programs blocked it, which was great. But ChatGPT let it rip, and they
mm,
generated something like 100 disinformation blogs in the course of an hour, and specifically tailored to individual groups, some to pregnant women, some to different ethnic populations.
mm.
And it mixed up a whole bunch of fake references that were made to look real with real references, so you couldn't sort out which was which. And so this is kind of a new frontier as well. As bad as things are getting, as Rene DeResta says, it could go infinite. So I think, we're still in for it for quite a while.
Stephen, thank you for that great question. And thank you, Peter, for that clear and terrifying answer. We have more questions. They're just flooding
I mean,
in.
the point is that
Mm,
disinformation has been around forever, right? I mean, and
right.
of course, and not only in the U.S. I mean, this is authoritarian regimes or totalitarian
Yeah.
regimes depended on it. This is Stalin depended on it, right? And
We were before the show
but
began. We were
but
talking about
but
Lysenko. Yeah.
but the fact that it's occurring in the modern age, because it's been adopted by a political party, the wellness influencers, now AI is makes it very dark.
Chris Aldrich asks this, a related question. How much of the anti-science movement is created by the lack of a better, broad education, which makes it easier for the average person to actively participate in knowledge and to participate in the scientific enterprise? Asked another way, has CP Snow's two cultures divide between the humanities and the sciences made things actively worse?
Yeah, I think, science literacy is a big component of it. A couple of things about that. First of all, when people talk about science literacy, I frame it a slightly different way because too often it's, talking about why people, why the average American citizen needs to know the second law of thermodynamics. And that's great if
Mhm.
they know the second law of thermodynamics, but I think almost as important is understanding the processes of science, because one of the ways the anti-science talking heads go after you is they, make it sound like getting a federal grant is a form of corruption, right? I mean, I had
Mhm. Mhm.
one talking head on Fox News go after me, who's now unfortunately very high up in one of the Health and Human Services agencies, says, well, of course, Hotez is, in bed with Fauci. He has funding from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases of the NIH. And I said,
There
what
you
the hell?
go.
I mean, I said, this is a guy who's at a medical school whose whole department of microbiology is funded by NIAID. And it was
Mm,
so
mm,
cynical
mm,
and disingenuous. It really
mm.
wanted to make me throw up. I mean, so I think, teaching the processes of science, I think, is really important. What does it mean to get a grant? What does it mean to do a major revision of a paper? What does a scientist do on a daily basis? I think that's not transparent. My friends at Research America, which is a policy group based in DC, do this
Mhm.
a interesting study every couple of years, and they always come out with the same answer, but I'm glad they keep doing it. And they asked the American people two questions in the survey. Question one, can you name a living scientist? Question
Mm,
two, can
mm,
you name an institution where biomedical research is conducted? And the numbers always stay
mm,
about the same. It turns out that consistently 75% of Americans cannot name a living scientist. So we're invisible. And when they do try, first they usually name Einstein or Jonas Salk, not realizing they've moved on, or then they'll mention Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson.
mm.
Maybe you've had them on there, which are they're wonderful guys. I love what they do. I love their work.
Yeah.
But they're not working scientists in the sense they're not struggling over the grants and the major revisions of the papers and what goes on at a scientific meeting and that. So we're invisible. And in terms of biomedical, where biomedical research is conducted, that's no people have no clue, where that happens. So we're silent, we're invisible by design. And I think it's really important that we, get people exposed to what a scientist is and how scientists are real people who have to worry about picking up their kids after school and making ends meet and all the other things that they do in addition to being important scientists. I think that's another really important part of science literacy. We should have, the high school students should be visiting research labs and talking to the scientists and seeing what they do on a daily basis. And I partly blame the leadership of the universities on that one, because they're
Mm,
so risk averse, right?
mm, mm,
And
mm,
especially now with all the recent
mhm.
attacks, but even before then, it's they don't like their docs and their scientists out there in the public domain, or what they'll get is, I mean, Baylor and Texas Children's are better than most, but a lot of places you'll get, well, yeah, you're an academic. I guess you're free to speak out, but don't screw this up. Don't get the
Mm.
institution in trouble. And of course, if you're out there in the public domain enough, I can promise you, you will screw it up and you will get the institution in trouble. And you need to know you have the backing of the institution. So people, because the consequences of that are of being invisible, is it allows the wellness influencers and the anti-vaxxers to portray us as sort of shadowy figures,
Mm, mhm.
in white coats plotting nefarious things, or they've got me in some basement lab at the World Economic Forum in Davos teaching George Soros how to pipette and and all this kind of stuff. And the crazier it sounds, the more people believe it.
They become compelling stories. I had a quick question about that myself, actually. What role do you see for science fiction in helping people develop scientific literacy?
I would say whatever makes science interesting to
Mm,
young people, whatever, if anything that makes young people think science is a cool thing to do, an important thing to do, and something that benefits society, I'm all in. Sometimes I'm asked, what do I think about the Nobel Prize? Don't you think that the Nobel Committee has been unfair and some person always gets left out? Shouldn't we just get rid of it? And I say, well, no, because it seems to capture the attention of the
mm,
press, and
mm,
so
mm.
it does serve an important function. So anything that gets it kind of out there, I Michael and my co-author in the last book is a bigger science fiction guy than I am, but
Talked about that.
yeah, well, all the Tolkien stuff, that was all
Yeah,
him. That was
yeah.
all Michael. I mean, I like Tolkien, but he got really into it. But yeah, I think that's so. In generally speaking, I think it's a positive.
I recommend Joan Slonczewski, who does fantastic science fiction about cell biology.
Oh, really? What's the last name?
Slonczewski. I
Okay, I'm
can
gonna
I can
look.
email you
I'll look
after.
for it. Yeah.
Yeah, she's terrific. There are a couple of quick observations in the chat, and then a question come up. Cecilia Vernes points out a nice thing. Her medical school has a pathways program for high school students, which is great. And Dylan Ridiger, says he doesn't see the humanities to blame for the decline of public trust in science, certainly not at scale. It
I
seems
agree. I
uh,
agree.
that
Yeah.
one
I
driver
mean,
is anti-intellectualism in general and contempt for expertise. But we have a question from a gentleman, a great friend of the program, a previous guest who is just down the road from you, actually, in Katy, outside of Houston. Tom Hames. Tom, why don't you open up your mic and cut loose?
Hello. Yes. I hope you're enjoying the nice weather here too.
I didn't realize Katie had Coliseum-like buildings like
Oh no,
that.
that's the
That's like
British Museum. I was there last month,
I
so
thought
or a
maybe
couple months
maybe
ago.
you're reproducing the British Museum in Katy, which I'd be all in. I'd be
It
there.
would be bigger. It would
We
be
we
bigger,
we
right?
used to have the warriors out here in the hidden Forbidden Gardens. You know that recreation of them.
Right.
It's gone now though. So so I had a question and a thought, and I wanted to know what you thought of the idea though. You know, we've been talking a lot about AI as a misinformation source. We've been talking about misinformation in general in social media, in the media, you know, traditional media, whatever. I mean, this comes up over and over again in what you've said. Um, I tend to view AI a little bit differently. First of all, it's not one thing. And I was wondering if you had thought about creating a known good source database for, you know, vaccine knowledge, medical knowledge, or science knowledge in general, you know, or various things. Because I create databases in Notebook LM all the time for my classes that have my curated sources in them that they can then search and query just like they would with ChatGPT, but I know where the answers are coming from. And I'm wondering if there's any thought toward having um, a blessed or whatever you want to call it by the scientific community, whatever whoever's running that now. I don't know. Is the National Science Foundation still out there?
Yeah, no,
Uh,
I think it
yeah,
makes sense. And by the way, I don't mean to condemn AI. We use AI, for vaccine design and a lot of things. And so
yeah,
it's a very powerful, obviously it's very powerful and it's going to be a way of the future. One of the things I think would be really helpful is we don't have a single one-stop shopping website that debunks all the false claims of the anti-vaccine activists. And I've been pushing, even before this year, the CDC to create something like that because it's nonstop and I think it's helpful not only for parents or for patients, but also for the primary care physicians who are many years outside of their first year biochemistry course and haven't thought about this stuff in a while. Let me give you an example. So we had our good friend, the Florida Surgeon General, Dr. Latipo, who's a virulent anti-vaxxer. He says the
mm,
mRNA vaccines are the antichrist, and then he says mRNA vaccines are causing turbo cancers. Why? Because they're contaminated with foreign DNA that's inserting into our genome next to oncogenes. And it sounds very sciency, right? Until you realize it's all BS. It's all made up, right? First of all, there's no such thing as a turbo cancer. They just made that term up. The second, the lipid nanoparticle can get nucleic acid past the cell membrane into the cytoplasm. But to get things past the nuclear membrane to the nucleus, you need electroporation. That's why we have no licensed DNA vaccines. And even if some did get in, we have interferon-inducible elements of our innate immune system that block integration of foreign nucleic acid into our genome. Otherwise, every time we eat a hamburger, we'd have cow DNA in our genome, and that doesn't happen. And so what happens? So I, go on CNN and MSNBC and debunk it. But guess where I'm not going? I'm not invited anymore on Fox News or Joe Rogan podcast. So it's the people who need to hear it the most are not hearing it, and all they're hearing is the nonsense from Dr. Latipo. And I think, if the primary care physicians had a website that, as you say, with everything, and it keeps on, they come up with new zingers, every other day. But the doc could at least look it up and said, "Oh yeah, that's why this is," because the patients are coming in now, and downloading all this stuff, and they're making the docs feel like they're not keeping up with the literature. Well, they are keeping up with the literature. There's the biomedical literature, it's just not keeping up with all the fake stuff, and they're under siege as well. So I think having that kind of a website would be great. So far, no one has really wanted to do that, but I think it wouldn't be that hard. It would be a little
yeah.
bit labor intensive. You have to get, a few FTEs to willing to do it, but I think it would. be a big public
It's
service.
really easy, technically speaking, these days to build that sort of stuff. I mean, that's really not the issue. I think the biggest issue you're going to run into there trying to do this, and this is something I have to watch out for too, is copyright. And all of these locked up journals that have good information in them, but that you're dependent on your doctor or some other subscriber to translate for you. And I know there's some places that are working on tools for doctors
Although
that
I would
are
think,
yeah,
I mean, for instance, when I write a scientific paper or even a book, I mean, I have citations, right? I'm
yeah,
citing things that are password protected, but you're honest about it and you provide the citation. I think that's fair. I think as
true.
long as you can cite the source where it comes from, I would think that would be fair game. But
Yeah, you
I'm
can't.
not
The
I'm
thing
not a
is, you can't
copyright
just.
lawyer, but
Yeah, no, you just can't. The thing is, Google, if you use, say, Notebook LM as a tool, for instance, but I mean, you can make your own.
hmm
No, Google prohibits you from sharing copyrighted works through your notebook because you can share your notebook to other people. But Google says no, it doesn't. I mean, it has no mechanism for enforcing that, but you could get into trouble if you do.
I see. I see.
And so, I mean, that's an issue. But yeah, there's got to be a workaround for that. It's really a question of information distribution. And I think I wouldn't count on the government to save you here. I would not look
Yeah.
to the CDC.
No,
No, we can't,
no.
unfortunately.
No.
Unfortunately.
And so therefore, what are other organizations that could take that on, for instance, that would be independent of that, and that maybe even international that could share this stuff in a way that's independent of the governments that the governments could refer to, but that wouldn't necessarily be government controlled, right?
Yeah,
That might be a good
absolutely.
project to do. So
Well,
Yeah,
Tom,
thank you.
I agree. Thank you for
thank,
that.
thank you for the great question. Thank you both for the discussion. In the chat, we had a quick exchange. I mentioned the Swiss public benefit AI project, which launched a couple of months ago, called Apertus, which is an academic project. And then our dear friend Ruben Puentedura mentioned a domestic product called Olmo from the Allen Institute. So there are links to those in the chat. Um, Friends, we're almost out of time, and I'll make sure that you have a chance to ask your last questions before we go. And just a shout out to a few folks like Lynn Greeno and Cecilia, who are just adding all kinds of great ideas and wonderful comments in the chat. Um, while people are still thinking and putting this together, um, I'd like to ask if you could look ahead, let's say 3 years, um, and let's assume that this November the federal House shifts from Republican majority to Democratic majority. Just for the sake of argument, if we assume that, where does how much worse does academic science get over the next 3 years? I mean, what should we be anticipating?
Well,
Uh,
one of the things that I say is, I don't want to be too doom and gloom, but one of the things I say also, I think too often we're hearing from our university heads and academic health centers and say, oh,
mhm,
just hunker down for a couple of years and it's all going to go back to the
yeah.
way it was. And this is a blip. And I don't feel that way. I think, this
Mm,
to me has a more enduring feel about it. I feel this is in some ways, it's a different country from the one I grew up in.
mm,
Watching Gemini space missions and things like this is
mhm,
something different. And so I think the key is don't hunker down, but recognize things are different and lean in, but lean in productive ways and think about how, I'm optimistic in the sense that I do think it's feasible to have a meaningful career in science and medicine despite all of the Maha attacks and everything else. But you're going to have to be sort of deliberate and strategic about it and recognize that we're not going to be able to rely on the federal government, the U.S. federal government, for supporting it. And I have two papers that I've written about it. They're half baked because they're sort of random thoughts. One is in PLOS Biology
mhm,
that
mhm,
called Your Career in U.S. Biosciences, and then another one in the Baker Institute website on, what MAHA is all about and what you do for as a physician, getting into healthcare delivery technologies and things like that. So I think, looking more and more to the private sector, learning I think it means if you're a physician or a doctoral level scientist, you're going to have to learn to be a bit more entrepreneurial,
Hmm, hmm,
and
hmm,
not and be open to having maybe a foot in the university, but also a foot in industry or a foot in the technology sector, and hoping that all the conflict of interest rules could be kind of sorted out in intellectual property. But
hmm,
being more fluid in the different spheres. And for instance, if you're a PhD or MD PhD student or a medical student, you don't have any education, right, about what how venture capital works, or
hmm,
how
hmm, hmm,
what private equity is about, what how to write business plans, things like that. And maybe that's what we should. There's this type of MBA called a tech MBA, and there may be
hmm,
some
hmm, hmm,
pieces of that we need to give those kinds of I call them life skills, really business skills to know how to do that. And I think if you're open to that and you're still passionate about doing something, it just means that things aren't going to be laid out for you as they have been, in terms of getting an academic position and doing it through government funded science, whether the NIH or NSF. And to be honest, it was never a very functional system to begin with.
hmm,
There was
hmm.
never sufficient funding. It was always hyper competitive and always too skewed towards the process. So in some ways, maybe this is a wake up call that we need to do things differently in any case.
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you. That is, it was a grim question, and you gave us a very detailed answer. Do you think the wellness industry, do you think the influencers who peddle snake oil, do you think that's likely to balloon over the next couple of years with this big infusion of federal support?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's got a lot of momentum behind it. I mean, and no one's holding any of these guys to accountability. I mean, all the zingers Kennedy comes up with a daily basis. Congress is invisible. The White House just lets it go. Even the Justice Department. So all of our checks and balances, and usually in government, is vanished. So this seems to be going on pretty much untethered. And so I don't know what necessarily reverses it. There's nothing obvious to me that reverses it. So I think we're in this for a while, and the key is to remain optimistic. And by optimistic, I don't mean move to France. I mean, I think there's still a lot of support for science. There's still a lot of money in the system and to support
Yeah,
science in the United States, but we're going to have to be more strategic and clever and out of the box in terms of how we access it to do important science.
more fluid, more entrepreneurial.
Yeah,
That's a
someone
good
write the
answer.
leadership about us has calling out the brokenness of the system for decades. Absolutely, yeah. No, it was it always had fatal flaws in it, and so reinventing it is not so bad. It's so awful that it's happening so catastrophically. There was the New York Times today had a article on the university rankings and
Hmm.
what the Chinese universities are doing to eat our lunch. And
They're
the number
way
one
up.
university is Zhejiang University,
Yeah,
and because the Chinese are investing in science big time,
yep.
and they'll be ahead of the game for a while.
Uh, well, maybe on the flip side of that, in the chat, Brian Rockwell, kudos, Brian, for spelling your name the right way. Says because it's not a blip, what's going on now. This is why there needs to be more interaction and connection between the sciences and the humanities, both as a whole at higher education institutions and within the courses themselves. Students need to be trained in all the elements necessary to ensure they don't just understand, but can communicate, defend, and support science and scientific thinking as well. And before I shared that, RJ Romanowski said that they're observing that their STEM students are thinking and asking for that same sort of thing as well. I'm curious, Peter.
I'm seeing it firsthand because this new book I'm working on has caused me to do a deep dive in American history, American intellectual history, even some European history, and I'm loving it. I mean, I feel like I'm in college again, and so I'm doing this. I'm just reading and listening to podcasts and books on tape about American intellectual
Excellent.
history. And I said, where have I been? Why didn't I, why am I waiting until I'm 67 years old to do this? And I guess better late than never. But I think that's right. I think, you know, training people more broadly and because one of the things we're realizing about the bad actors on Fox News, the talking heads, was they were all bantering around academic freedom and saying whatever
Hmm.
they want, but one of the things that was missing that no one talks about was where's the professionalism, where was the ethics, right? There was this is what happens when you strip away ethics from science. And another reason why the humanities is so important, I think, to fold into scientific education.
I can I ask one last question before we
Sure.
go? And you mentioned turning to optimism, and I'm curious, what are your sources for optimism in this context? What keeps you going when you think about science versus anti-science?
I think what keeps me going is recognizing that, civilizations, do ebb and flow and they go through down periods, but I think there's still a lot of resilience in this country that can help us bounce back. I think the universities, still have a lot of strength, and I do a lot of these what are called whiteboarding exercises with young people. It's something I like to do. I put their name at the top and we have them I ask them two questions because most young people don't get mentoring in universities anymore. So I ask them two questions that most of the time it's
Mm,
the first time anyone's ever asked them, and that is, what does success look like for you in 10 to 15 years? And what big problem in life do you want to solve? And
mm,
it may seem obvious, but at these really high-powered universities that I've taught at, everyone's really smart and everyone's so focused on the next big prestigious step in their career that they haven't. It's amazing how they haven't taken the time to step back and really think about the big stuff
mhm,
that they want to achieve. And when you do that, you see the light bulb go off and they're excited and sometimes they get flustered by the question and they have to go away for 2 weeks to think about it, which is totally fine that they're doing that. And I think we need to do more of that. But I think, we still can do big things in the United States. But as I say, we're going to have to be more deliberate and strategic about how you do it.
well, we can do it best, I think, with a company of great thinkers and leaders like yourself. Dr. Peter Hotez, this has been a fantastic hour of conversation. You've been so generous with your time and your thought. What's the best way for people to keep up with you? How can they follow your work?
My books, it's a pretty pathetic looking WordPress website that I have, peterhotez.org, but at least it'll give you some of my writings in the books. I'd like to say you could follow me on Twitter. And I'm still on Twitter partly because, with being on the cable news channels all the time, wound up getting 400,000 followers on Twitter.
Hey,
And of course, now it's been flat for several years because Elon switches up the algorithm so they can't see me as often. Um, but I'm still putting stuff out there. I don't use it as much to have discussions with people because it's too toxic. But at least I'll announce anytime I've written a paper or a book or someplace that I'm
mm,
speaking, and it has that function. I'm also on Blue Sky now as well, and that's a little friendlier, even though it doesn't have the same number of people following it. And then going on talking to amazing people like you. I mean that's also what keeps me going is during the day, I'm in the mix. I'm talking to people like Brian Alexander. That's really stimulating. At night, you wake up in the middle of the night and thinking about all the death threats and calls for my public execution. That gets rough. I have some rough nights, and bad dreams. But during the day, talking to people like you really helps me through.
thank you. We are here for you, as much daylight as we can bring. And I'm saying we because all the people here on the forum, you guys have asked the great questions and you've shared the great thoughts. Thank you so much, Dean, Professor, Dr. Peter Hotez. Thank you for your work. Please keep it going. And we're all looking forward to reading your new book on Texas and diseases. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. You're the best.
Take care. Take care, everybody. And everybody else, we have sessions scheduled out for the next few months. So please head to the forum website if you haven't been there already, forum.futureofeducation.us, and you can see sessions scheduled a whole range of topics. I hope everybody, if you're in the northern countries, are staying warm and dry as needed. And everybody else, I hope you're having a really good spring semester. Please take care, everybody. Be well, and we'll see you next time online. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.